Okay, so hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Who's Coming Back to School? Tools to Monitor Return to Learning. My name is Margie Bott and I will be your facilitator today. I see that we have lots of different organizations and geographies present today. Thank you everybody for joining in. In addition to being your facilitator today, I am the lead for the Education and Crisis and Conflict Network, or ECCN, and a technical advisor at Education Development Center for the USAID's Leading Through Learning Global Platform. This webinar is the first in a series of activities and engagement under this global platform, and you'll learn more about it in the final 30 minutes of this webinar during the ECCN launch event. I hope many of you can stay tuned for that. I want to say a huge thanks to everyone on the Leading Through Learning Secretariat who have contributed to this event. We also have subject matter experts joining us today from USAID who will respond to your questions throughout the webinar in the chat. Nina Weisenhorn, Beth Johnson, and Elena Walls, will you please turn on your cameras to wave to the participants and add your name, title, and area of expertise to the chat so the audience knows who you are. All right, thank you, subject matter experts. We're so lucky to have you. So if you do have questions for them, please do put them in the chat. They'll be happy to respond directly to your questions there. So for this webinar, there are a few goals we have today. The main one being that the goal is for education sector practitioners, such as yourselves, to learn about how to monitor which children are returning to school and how to use that data to modify education programming to facilitate access to learning for all children. And to meet this goal, this webinar has 4 objectives. As we go through these objectives, we will give you a moment to assess how confident you feel demonstrating or applying skills or competencies related to monitoring return to learning. We're going to use the polling function to do this. Some of you may be familiar with it. For those who are not so familiar, to access the poll, go to the bottom right corner of your Google Meet screen and find the 3 shapes icon. You'll see an icon with a triangle, square, and a circle. Once you click on that icon, you'll see an option to take a poll. Click on that to see the poll appear. Just before we do the poll, I wanted to note that all responses are confidential. So while we'll share the response to the polls after each poll, your name will not appear on the screen. We know there are folks here with a range of experience and background. Some of you are just getting started on monitoring. For others, this is actually your entire job. And still others, you're just here out of curiosity. So one thing we all have in common here is that we're all here to learn. So we appreciate your honesty in responding to these questions. It's a self-report, so there are no wrong answers. We will take a look at these objectives again at the end of the webinar to see if your confidence level has changed. So let's look at poll 1. And please open up the poll function and tell us how confident do you feel in your ability to list at least 3 tools or strategies used to monitor which children are returning to some form of schooling. Give you a couple of seconds to respond to that poll. Okay. Can we share the poll results, Anita? Oh, I see someone has a question about how to access the polls. So on your Google Meet screen, on the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see an icon called Activities. It's a triangle, square, and circle icon. If you click on that, then you'll see something that says Polls. And once you click on Polls, you'll be able to take this first poll. I'll give folks just another second to do that. So for this question, list your confidence level to list at least 3 tools or strategies used for monitoring which children are returning to learning. Okay, let's see the poll results. All right. So let's move on to the next objective. Please tell us how confident you feel in your ability to explain how tools 1.1 and 1.2 in the Return to Learning Toolkit work and their purpose to others in your office and sector, implementing partners and education authorities. How confident do you feel about sharing about these tools and explaining what they are to folks in your office, to implementing partners and education authorities? The poll is now open. All right. Anita, can you share the results once people have responded? Okay, thank you. And then finally, for objective 3, how confident do you feel in your ability to ask and respond to questions designed to monitor and track which children are returning to school? Take a couple of seconds to answer this poll. Okay, let's share the results. I see folks are moderately to high level confidence in their ability to do this. That's great. We also have some folks who are minimally and less confident. And then finally, for the final poll, how confident do you feel in your ability to determine when and how to use these return to learning monitoring tools as the school year starts in your country? Take a moment to answer that poll. Okay, let's take a look at the results. Okay, most people feel minimal level of confidence to be able to do that. Hopefully, we will be able to change some of that confidence level after we go through some of these resources we'll share today. So thank you everybody for your honesty in responding to the polls. Like I said, we will come back to these polls at the end of the webinar to see how our confidence level has changed. So another activity for us, as you know, during today's webinar, we will focus on the USAID Return to Learning Toolkit. However, we know that there are lots of other tools and strategies currently used to monitor who is returning to learning and who is not. We want to hear from you about what tools and strategies you're aware of or using yourself. We also know that there are lots of challenges to monitoring return to learning as well, and we want to hear about those. In a moment, you'll have the opportunity to share some of these with us so we can plan more relevant events and other opportunities for all of us in the future. We will use a Google Slide activity deck, which some of you may be familiar with. And those of you who are not, I will provide some instructions and we'll share on our screen how to best use this tool. So when you open the link that we'll soon share in the chat, you will see the first page that looks like this on your screen. For this activity, we will be using slides 2 through 11 as virtual flip charts to crowdsource information on tools and challenges relevant to your specific contexts. Note that slides are organized by last name or surname. Please scroll through the slides on the left-hand side of your screen to find the slide to which your last name is assigned and add your responses to the sticky notes there. Since there are several participants on this webinar and you cannot all contribute to the same slide, please only add comments to your designated slide. The first question we'd like to address is, what are you currently doing or seeing in your context when it comes to monitoring which children and youth are returning to some form of schooling? Feel free to add the names of specific tools you're using, modalities, resource links, anything that you have heard about, seen, used yourself, and found useful. The slide in the activity slide deck will look like what you see currently on your screen. And to add your response to the question, just click on the gray square or sticky note, as you see my colleague Anita doing right now, and make sure you're on your designated slide, and you can type in your response. Note that on this slide, only participants with the last name that begins with the letter between A and D should add their responses to this page. So for example, since my last name is Bott and starts with a B, I would add my response on this slide. If your name does not start with a letter between A and D, you can scroll through the slides on the left-hand side till you find a screen to find your designated slide. And then to find the next series of slides for question 2, you will need to scroll through the slides on the left-hand side of your screen, as you see Anita doing. Here you will answer, what are some challenges you're facing when it comes to monitoring equity and inclusion in the return to school? Are there specific tools, resources, or opportunities you are seeking to do it better? Again, don't forget to look for the slides that correspond to your last name. So we're going to share the slide deck now in the chat. Please go ahead and click on the link. Find your designated slide, and we'll give you 3 minutes to add your responses. Please type in the chat if you have any questions. I see lots of folks jumping onto the slide deck and adding their responses. If you have any questions, make sure to just come back to the chat and ask. See, folks are using community monitoring, designing early warning systems for dropout risk monitoring. That's great. A couple of folks have mentioned early warning system monitoring. Mobile phones, reach out via community. Great. I see schools are still closed in Uganda, but there is a plan. A specific EMIS-related tool will be used. The cluster promotes the education cluster monitoring tool for planning and monitoring EIE response, including return to learning. Thanks for sharing the link. I think that's probably Sierra or maybe another cluster colleague. Someone's pointing out that there's a GPE COVID response grant that allowed for rapid education analysis in February 2021. That's great. All right, I see lots of great ideas and tools and resources people are using. If folks want to move on to question 2, starting at slide 7, that would be great. This is where we want to hear about what are some challenges you're facing when it comes to monitoring for equity and inclusion in return to learning. Are there any specific tools, resources, or opportunities that you're seeking that you'd like for us to think about when we think about future opportunities? Lack of standardized tools, yes. remember to use your last name as a reference to get on the right slide between slide 7 and 11 for the second response. Lack of remedial programming, lack of data, especially on equity. We've heard that before. Aggregated data, yes. If there are any opportunities that you'd like to see or any resources you'd like to for us to present on or for you to present on through our platform, you can also add those ideas here. Okay, so some of the challenges that I'm seeing, I think maybe we'll be able to address some of those using this return to learning tool that we'll be sharing more about. And we'll keep this open. So if folks want to come back and add a couple more ideas into the slide deck, that would be great. But in the interest of time, maybe we will move on to sharing about this great resource. So let's dive into the Return to Learning Toolkit, focusing specifically on tools 1.1 and 1.2. I'd like to introduce you to Kayla Bover. Kayla is an independent consultant who worked on USAID's COVID-19 education task team, particularly around developing the Return to Learning Toolkit, and provided technical assistance to USAID missions and partners working on the COVID-19 education responses in their countries. You may remember her. You may have seen her before. She has expertise in alternative, accelerated, and catch-up education in crisis and conflict-affected contexts. And she continues to support USAID through the rollout of the Return to Learning tools. Thank you for being here and presenting this tool to us, Kayla. We are so lucky to have you. If you have any questions during the presentation for Kayla, please add them to the chat, and our subject matter experts from USAID, who are of course also very familiar with the tool, will do their best to respond in the chat. If we do have time at the end of the presentation, Kayla will answer a couple of questions at the end. If you can, please add your question noting whether it's for Kayla or for one of the USAID subject matter experts. If we do not get to your question, we will collect the questions that are in the chat and respond to them offline once the webinar is over. So turning it over to you, Kayla, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Margie, and thank you all for being here today, and thank you for the opportunity to share on two of the tools in the Return to Learning Toolkit. As you've pointed out, Margie, the purpose of the toolkit is really to support USAID staff, implementers, and partners in the ministries of education, higher education that you're working with in the work that you're doing to help all learners return to a range of formal and alternative education settings. And these previous activities have really highlighted some of the excellent tools and some of the excellent work that you're already doing so far. And we hope that these tools that we're going to present today can really add to that. We also hope that it can address some of the barriers that you've mentioned. So we know from data and from experience that learners have faced extreme impacts from this pandemic, and many of those effects are going to prove challenges to returning to education for many of them. And some of those challenges or barriers include worsened economic barriers or effects, such as the high cost of education and the need to work to contribute to family income, increased educational barriers, such as not having had access to remote learning during school closures, lack of flexible options for those who cannot return to formal schooling, and learners falling behind their peers during school closures or aging out. And it might also have exacerbated psychosocial and protection-related barriers, such as having lacked psychosocial health and protection services during the pandemic, fear and anxiety about returning to in-person learning, and for girls in particular, early marriage and pregnancy. Now, the tools that we're about to look at fit within priority 1 of the Return to Learning framework, which is around re-engaging all learners. And they also contribute to the cross-cutting objective of progressively working towards dimensions of equity and inclusion. And as has been shown in five country case studies recently conducted by USAID, we really have found that there is a shared commitment to ensuring that all learners are able to return to education as schools reopen. But the challenge that was really found is that it's difficult to operationalize that commitment. So our hope is that these tools can support that objective. Tools 1.1 and 1.2, which we're going to look at today, are really designed to be used together to better help all learners return to education. Specifically, the purpose of these tools is to help you first, in Tool 1.1, reflect on the constraints that various groups of learners might have in returning to education, and then strategize on how to reach them. And second, in Tool 1.2, monitor the return to learning in a way that allows you to disaggregate by specific marginalized populations in order to adapt and improve your strategies to re-engage all learners. Now, before we talk about who should use these tools and who can benefit from using these tools, I'd really like to hear from you. So if you can open up the tool function again, which is by clicking on the three shapes in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and then clicking on the polls feature, let me know at what level you'll primarily be working to support the return to learning for all learners. So Anita, if you're able to open that poll, great. So some things you might say include that you'll be working at the level of the school or other education center, at the district or subnational level, at the national level, at the regional level, or at the global level. So take 5 more seconds to answer that poll. Great, and Anita, if you can broadcast the results. Thank you all for responding to the poll. Perfect, so great. So there's a wide spread for sure, but it looks like the majority of participants on the call will be working at the national and the global level, although there is certainly several folks who will be working at the school or level of the learning center or university. And really, we hope that these tools can be adapted to be used at the various levels. So, for example, if you're working at the school level, you might be working with the principal, with teachers, school support staff, girl and boy students, community leaders, parents, self-advocacy groups. At the subnational or national level, we think that you might be working with representatives from ministries of education, gender or youth, specialists in child protection, disability inclusion and gender, self-advocacy groups, NGOs, donors, UN bodies, and others. And at the regional level, we think you might be working with other donors, implementing partners, UN bodies, and advocacy or coordination organizations. So let's dive into what is included in these tools. And tool 1.1, which is pictured in part here, is called Identifying Barriers and Strategies to Re-engage the Most Marginalized Learners. The purpose of this tool here is really just that, as the name says, to understand how the pandemic has affected learners and to identify strategies to help all learners come back to education. Now, using the tool requires 3 main steps. And the first step, and this is really important, is to locate existing sources of information. And that might include research studies, evaluation reports, EMIS data, or other sources of data that give you recent, reliable information on barriers that different groups of learners face for returning to education. And then, where there are gaps in your knowledge, it's really important to consult with key stakeholders to understand more about those barriers. So we're really seeing that many studies are emerging that highlight the impacts of the pandemic on learners, and that includes in specific countries or regions. And some of these reports specifically identify how the pandemic is affecting learners' ability to return to education. And many of these reports and studies are focused on specific population groups, such as girls and displaced learners. However, it's also really, really important to make sure you get a more contextualized understanding. And that includes understanding the barriers for different groups of learners in different geographical regions of your country. It also requires looking at, for example, how different marginalized identities intersect. So for example, how refugee girls are impacted differently than refugee boys. And this can be done through a range of ways, and that might include needs assessments, consultations with experts and self-advocacy groups, focus groups, and surveys with learners and families, for example. So after you've gathered the information that you need, it's time to then describe the key challenges that different groups of learners face in the return to learning, as well as what they're going to need to overcome those barriers. So we're going to look at an example, and here again is sort of a zoomed in snapshot of the tool that includes these 3 columns, which you're going to respond to for every population group that you identify, is marginalized and vulnerable of not returning to learning. So taking an example, let's imagine that I am leading a task team at the national level in a specific country. My colleagues in the Ministry of Education, Gender, and Youth are gathering to make decisions about how to tailor the national Back to School campaign to meet the specific needs of learners who are most likely to have difficulties returning. We have gathered our information on how different learners have been impacted by the pandemic, and specifically how those impacts poses barriers for the ability to return to school. And so we'll start first in the first column by listing the barriers and needs for adolescent girls and women. So in our example country, we have learned that most households, and especially those who are already experiencing poverty, have had a decrease in household income. As well, girls are more likely than boys to take on household chores when their parents are away from the home working. And we're also seeing that girls are working more to contribute to the household income. And some data also suggests that there has been an increase in early pregnancy. So these are some of the barriers that might prevent them from being able to return to learning. To support girls to be able to return to education, then in the next column, we need to look at what they're going to need to be able to access education. And so based on the fictional evidence that we've collected in this example country, we are thinking that girls will need access to truly free education. Families might need financial support, so girls don't need to go to work. And adolescent mothers might need childcare and other types of support to be able to prioritize their education. And then after filling in these 2 columns, our team would then move on to the list of barriers for learners with disabilities and displaced learners, for instance. That would be in the following rows. So then after you've listed those barriers and needs for each of the groups that you identify to be most at risk of dropping out, you're then going to want to look back to the needs of each of these groups and identify strategies that you can feasibly and realistically implement that can help you to address those needs. So looking back at our example, some of the strategies that our task team might identify that are feasible in our context could be, for example, waiving secondary school tuition fees and removing the hidden costs of basic education, rolling out cash transfers for adolescent mothers who return to school, and designing and implementing accelerated education programs that provide on-site childcare for overage, out-of-school girls and young women. And as you're identifying strategies per group, it's very likely that you'll find that some of the strategies targeted at a specific group of learners are actually beneficial for all learners. So, to wrap up the discussion of Tool 1.1, I'd like to invite to join me on the screen USAID's Nina Weisenhorn, who is a Senior Advisor for Education in Crisis, and Nina is going to share a couple of takeaway messages from Tool 1.1. Thanks, Nina.
Thanks so much, Kayla. Your presentation of Tool 1.1 really captured well how it can help staff and partners advance USAID's priority of reaching vulnerable and marginalized learners in response to COVID-19. When selecting strategies, the purpose is not to create a wish list of ideal interventions, but rather to really identify those strategies that are realistic and feasible within your context. This requires reflecting collectively, as you've identified here, Kayla, on those priorities, the different stakeholders involved. This includes understanding political will to implement certain interventions, the economic feasibility of certain strategies, and the sociocultural norms related to certain barriers. It's important to draw on new or pre-crisis analyses that identify the bidirectional relationship between the education sector and these local dynamics. Hopefully, you're already using the Rapid Education and Risk Analysis Toolkit that USAID has provided to understand these relationships, or perhaps conducting political economy analyses within your own programs. So when we think about this example, we might see that it can be politically challenging to implement wide sweeping changes to policies related to allowing certain populations like refugees to formal schools or pregnant mothers. But it might be possible to increase access with support of donors or other nonprofit organizations and development organizations for at least the time being. It might also be, it may not be feasible to provide widespread cash transfers, but it might be possible to truly make secondary education free with changes to fee policies. And it might be socioculturally realistic. It might not be socioculturally realistic to expect adolescent mothers to use paid childcare options. Perhaps it is possible to support a community-based childcare alternative. Second, the social, political, and economic realities that enable or constrain the selected strategies is what makes it particularly important to use this tool in partnership with key stakeholders. This could be done in different ways. For example, at the national level, this tool could be used in a national task force, as was used in this example with Kayla, and a group of responsible education authorities and technical or financial partners who are working together to develop a back-to-school campaign and are prioritizing how to allocate emergency funding for that purpose. At the school level, you may be working directly with a parent-teacher organization and to develop a plan for community-based interventions, like involving outreach workers who work with learners at risk of dropping out and their families. Finally, third takeaway is to be crisis-specific about these new barriers to education that have emerged for different population groups, or the pre-existing barriers that have been exacerbated by the current crisis. So often we see these conversations can come back to the same challenges that we face and that are endemic to the education system. But by using a mix of data sources and ensuring the perspectives from marginalized populations are included, we can help to hone in on those changes to education barriers and to thus target strategies accordingly. Much of that can be gathered from what exists, but some of it may need to be collected in preparation for these reflections. So back to you, Kayla.
Great. Thank you, Nina. And so at this point, after your information is gathered, the needs are identified, and strategies are prioritized, it's then time to carry out those interventions and get learners back into schools or alternative education centers. And really essential to that then is how to monitor who is coming back to education over time. And this is where tool 1.2 comes in. But first, I'd like to ask you to answer another poll. So opening the polling function again, please let me know what the primary source of data that you will be working with to monitor the return to learning. And some examples might include EMIS data, enrollment and attendance records, community-based surveys, and you can also type into the chat if there are different types of data sources that you'll use. Take about 5 more seconds to complete the poll. All right, and Anita, if you can share the results with us. Thank you everyone for completing the poll. And so we're seeing, again, a widespread, but it looks like a lot of you plan to use enrollment and attendance records as well as community-based surveys. And these, as well as some of the other resources and activities that you noted in the previous activity, those are really among the many sources of data that you can use in order to complete tool 1.2. Which is called Monitoring Re-Enrollment, especially of the most marginalized learners. Now, the purpose of this tool is to rapidly estimate which learners are returning to education and which are not, in order to adapt your strategies to progress towards a more equitable and inclusive return to learning. And of course, I just want to note that ministries, implementers, and others might already have systems in place to track the return to learning. And a good example of this is the cluster tool that Ciara posted. You might be using something like that or something different. We really think that Tool 1.2 can still be helpful to you because the principles and the ideas behind it are really designed to help you think further about how to understand the rates at which different groups of learners are returning over time. Now, completing the tool, which again is pictured here, is fairly simple. The steps of the tool can be thought of as 3 waves of data collection at 3 points in time, immediately starting at the start of school reopenings, 1 month later, and 3 months later. So to use another example, let's say I'm working with colleagues at an NGO-led accelerated education program that has 6 centers across a single district in a specific country. So in column 1, we'll first select or identify the key learner groups who we want to track separately. And then in column 2, we're going to enter baseline information about the number of learners that were enrolled when education was closed. And so in this example, we had the following distribution. 720 total learners were enrolled before schools were closed, 402 of which were girls and 318 of which were boys. Among those were 68 learners with disabilities, and just over half are refugees. And really, you could improve your monitoring as well by disaggregating, for example, girls and boys with disabilities, girl and boy refugees as well. So during the first week of the AE centers being open, we then are going to document the number of learners who are able to come back and calculate what percentage that represents of the learners previously enrolled from each group. So in this example, 309 out of 720 total learners were back in school at the end of the first week. Among those were 105 girls and 204 boys. Only 10 out of the 68 learners with disabilities were able to return, but most of the displaced learners were able to return. We then repeat data collection at 1 month and then again at 3 months. And so as we're looking at the data here, we can see a couple of trends. So learners with disabilities were really struggling the most to come back, even at 3 months. But displaced learners were really successful since the early days of school reopenings at coming back, and they came back in high numbers by the 3rd month. We can also see that boys started coming back at rates faster than girls, but overall girls ended up coming back at 3 months at higher rates than boys. And also briefly, just to mention that you can change these intervals in order to suit your needs. And it might even be that if the process of reopenings are already underway in your country, you might be able to, or you might be entering data at the later waves rather than having started in the first week. But the idea really is still the same. It's to capture a good enough estimate about the rates of return of different groups of learners over time. So now, as we've looked at both of these tools, I'll hand it back to Nina for some final takeaways.
Thanks again, Kayla. As you said, this is a good enough estimate, and Tool 1.2 can be used at different levels, such as the school level, the district level, and the national level for many different purposes, same as Tool 1.1. This can also help you to understand differences between geographic regions or different population groups. For example, we can look at the differences between rural, peri-urban, or urban districts. And the purpose of using the tool in this way is not to be evaluative or to say which location is more successful in helping learners return to the classroom or to the virtual classroom, but rather to improve planning and to prioritize response strategies and targeting those strategies to those who need them most. And finally, it's essential to re-emphasize that both of these tools should be used together. In other words, you start with tool 1.1, which helps you to identify barriers and feasible interventions. Then, as you implement those strategies, you monitor those strategies progressively using 1.2. And when you have a good enough estimate about who's returning and who's struggling to return, for example, at the first moment in time, you can revisit 1.1, conduct further consultations about why specific groups of learners are struggling, what strategies may not be as successful as you had intended, and to reprioritize or discuss new feasible strategies. In the end, the purpose of these tools together, or by adapting them in a way that suits your needs, is to progressively learn about and to address the barriers of different groups of learners, and to be able to ensure that they all can return to the classroom, whether it's in person or the virtual classroom. Back to you, Kayla.
Great. Thank you, Nina. And now, having shared these tools with you, we're going to do an activity to reflect on how you're already monitoring again, how you can improve it using these tools, and specifically thinking about that in your context. So we're going to give you 30 seconds to first think silently about 2 specific questions, and then we're going to put you in breakout groups, and you'll have 12 minutes to share and discuss your thoughts. So up on the screen, you can see these questions as well. They are, first, which are the population groups in your particular context who you think are going to have difficulty returning? And second, which of these groups do you think you are currently monitoring well? Which are you not monitoring well, and how can you improve? So take 30 seconds to think to yourself, jot down some notes on paper if you'd like, and we'll then put you in breakout groups.
And many of you are coming back from the breakout groups. Thank you so much for the rich discussion there. I'll hand it to Kayla to go over a few points with us before we start the ECCN launch. Thanks, Kayla.
Great. Thank you, Margie. Welcome back, everyone. And I hope that those discussions were really interesting and fruitful. So as we wrap up, to recap, over the past 50 minutes, we have heard from you all a little bit about what you're currently doing or seeing in your context when it comes to monitoring the return to learning, some challenges you've faced. We've also shared with you tools 1.1 and 1.2, which are among several tools in the Return to Learning Toolkit developed by USAID. And then you've had brief conversations with other education sector practitioners about your current monitoring efforts and how to enhance them. So we really are hopeful that the tools we've presented today can be helpful in strengthening these monitoring activities that you have. Looking forward to ongoing discussions with you in the future. And yeah, I guess I just want to say thank you very much for having us, and I will pass it back to Margie.
All right, thanks everybody. So before we begin the ECCN launch, for those of you who participated in the Return to Learning webinar, we just wanted to quickly do a closing poll on your confidence on measuring returning to learning. If you were not a part of the previous webinar, you can feel free to ignore the poll. For others, please click on the bottom right corner of your Google screen where you'll find the polls option. And so just quickly, after learning about the Return to Learning Toolkit, how confident do you feel in your ability to list at least 3 tools or strategies used to monitor which children are returning to some form of schooling? Once again, if you didn't participate in the webinar, don't worry about this poll. Just for a quick couple of seconds for people to fill it in. Okay, Anita, can you show us the results from this poll? All right, moderate level of confidence. That's great. Let's do the second poll. After this webinar, please rate your level of confidence to explain how tools 1.1 and 1.2 in the toolkit work and their purpose to your colleagues, implementing partners, and other education authorities. Take a second. All right, Anita, can we see the results? All right, looks like people feel moderate level or moderately high level. Some people feel high level of confidence. That's great. And then for objective 3, just quickly, let's do the third poll. After this webinar, please rate your level of confidence to ask and respond to questions that can help monitor and track which children are returning to school. Once again, if you're joining for the ECCN launch, please ignore the polls. This is for a previous webinar that we just had on return to learning. Okay, Anita, can we see the results for this one? Once again, people feel moderate level or moderately high level of confidence. And then finally, the last poll for this event. After this webinar, please rate your level of confidence to consider when and how you can use this tool in your work as the school year starts. Couple of seconds to fill that one out. Okay, let's see the results, Anita. Similarly, most people feel moderate and moderately high level of confidence. All right, this is really all helpful information for us. I hope you all found this webinar useful and of interest for your work. We will, of course, have more events to come. And I hope you can all stay tuned for this next event for the launch of the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, which we'll get started with in just a moment.